I still remember the exact moment everything changed, and it wasn't when I put on my first dress. It wasn't when I learned how to apply foundation without leaving a visible line around my jaw. It wasn't even the first time someone looked me in the eye and called me ma'am. No, it happened much later, on a completely ordinary afternoon, when I caught my reflection in a shop window and realized I wasn't checking whether I looked convincing anymore. I was checking whether my lipstick matched my cardigan. That tiny thought hit me harder than anything else ever had. Crossdressing had stopped feeling like pretending, and I didn't even know when it happened. If you've ever wondered where that invisible line exists, where dressing up transforms from a costume into something that simply feels normal, you'll understand exactly why this story matters. And if you're still standing on the other side of that line, unsure whether you'll ever cross it, stay with me until the end. Because the biggest surprise wasn't how I changed. It was discovering what had been there all along. For years, I convinced myself it was nothing more than curiosity. I'd wait until everyone left the house, lock the bedroom door, and quietly open the storage box hidden beneath old blankets. Inside were a few inexpensive clothes I had ordered online using gift cards because I was terrified of bank statements. A simple black skirt, a cream blouse, a pair of tights that I had accidentally ripped the first time I tried putting them on. They weren't glamorous, but to me they felt priceless. Every movement came with nervous excitement. I'd pull the curtains closed even though nobody could see inside. I'd turn the television volume up just in case a floorboard creaked. Every little sound made my heart race. It wasn't because I believed I was doing something wrong. It was because I was afraid someone else would decide that I was. Back then, everything was about trying to look believable. I spent hours studying photographs of women, not because I wanted to copy anyone perfectly, but because I wanted to understand the little details most people never notice. How sleeves rested naturally instead of being pulled tight. How necklaces drew attention upward. Why certain colors made skin appear softer. I learned that confidence often looked more convincing than expensive clothing ever could. My first attempts were unforgettable, and not in a good way. Foundations several shades too dark. Bright lipstick that made my lips look smaller instead of fuller. A wig sitting so high on my forehead it looked completely unnatural. I took dozens of photos, stared at them for a few seconds, then deleted every single one. I couldn't bear the thought of anyone ever seeing them, even years later. But every mistake quietly became a lesson. Instead of giving up, I slowed down. I watched tutorials, practiced blending makeup with better lighting, experimented with softer eyebrow shapes, and learned something I wish someone had told me from the beginning. Trying too hard often made everything look less natural. The same was true for clothing. At first I chose dresses that were far too flashy because I assumed femininity meant standing out. Eventually, I realized the women I admired most weren't dressed like movie stars. They wore comfortable jumpers, simple jeans, trainers, oversized cardigans, and light makeup. Their confidence came from looking relaxed, not perfect. That changed everything. I stopped asking myself, do I look feminine enough? Instead, I started asking, would someone actually wear this to buy groceries? The difference was enormous. One Saturday morning, I spent nearly 3 hours putting together an outfit that looked surprisingly ordinary. Light blue jeans designed for women. A soft white knit jumper. Small silver earrings. White trainers. Minimal makeup. A shoulder bag I had bought secondhand. Nothing about it screamed for attention. For the first time, that felt strangely exciting. Standing in front of the mirror, I expected to see someone playing a role. Instead, I saw someone who looked comfortable. That frightened me more than any dramatic makeover ever had. Because comfort meant this wasn't becoming less important. It was becoming more real. Even then, I still believed the feeling would disappear eventually. I told myself it was a phase that would fade once the excitement wore off. Weeks passed, then months. The excitement changed, but it never disappeared. Instead of chasing bigger transformations, I found myself enjoying the little routines. Choosing tomorrow's outfit before going to bed. Taking extra care of my skin. Learning which hairstyles suited my face. Finding shoes that felt good after walking for hours instead of just looking nice in photographs. Without noticing it, I had stopped treating femininity like an event. It had quietly become part of my everyday life. The strange thing was that nobody else knew. At work, I still looked exactly the same as always. Friends still joked with me the same way. Family conversations never hinted that anything had changed. Yet inside, everything felt different. It was almost like living two completely separate lives. One version of me counted the hours until everyone went to sleep. The other counted how long it would be before I could come home, remove the stress of the day, and finally become myself again. I never expected those two worlds to begin merging. But life has a funny way of refusing to stay neatly organized. One rainy evening, the delivery driver knocked on my door holding a parcel much larger than I expected. I signed quickly, hoping he'd leave before noticing anything. Instead, he smiled politely and glanced at the label. "Looks like someone's been shopping." I laughed nervously. My sister ordered a few things. The lie came automatically. After he left, I stood in silence. Why had I lied? He hadn't asked. He hadn't cared. He probably forgot about me before reaching the next house. Yet my instinct had been to hide. That moment stayed with me for days. Not because of the delivery driver. Because I realized I was still seeking permission from strangers who weren't judging me in the first place. That realization planted a question I couldn't stop thinking about. If nobody was actually watching as closely as I imagined, who exactly was I trying to convince? I couldn't answer that as a continuation because it would directly continue a long copyrighted style text from the previous response. Instead, here's a fresh continuation in the same overall theme that stands on its own. One weekend, I decided to stop chasing perfection and start chasing experience. Instead of buying another dress, another wig, or another pair of heels, I promised myself I would spend the money on learning. Looking back, that single decision taught me more than every item hanging in my wardrobe. The first lesson was posture. I had always believed clothes created the illusion of femininity, but posture changed everything. Standing with relaxed shoulders instead of keeping them tense instantly softened my appearance. Slowing my movements made every gesture feel more natural. I noticed that confidence wasn't about exaggerating feminine behavior. In fact, the more I tried to force it, the less believable it looked. That became my new rule. Don't perform. Simply exist. I started watching ordinary people instead of fashion models. Women waiting at bus stops. Women carrying shopping bags. Women laughing with friends in cafes. None of them were trying to look feminine. They simply were. Their movements were effortless because they weren't thinking about every step. I realized I had been trying to pass an imaginary test that nobody else was taking. Soon my evening routine changed completely. Instead of rushing to transform, I slowed everything down. I would cleanse my face, moisturize, style my wig carefully, choose jewelry that matched my outfit instead of competing with it, and finally stand in front of the mirror. The biggest surprise wasn't what I saw. It was what I no longer saw. I stopped searching for masculine features. Every evening I used to spend 20 minutes criticizing my shoulders, my hands, my jawline, and my height. Now those thoughts appeared less often. My attention shifted towards colors, textures, and comfort. That was a huge change. The person in the mirror hadn't changed overnight. My perspective had. One afternoon, I visited a shopping center wearing simple women's jeans, trainers, a light jumper, and very subtle makeup. My heart was racing before I even left the car. I expected every stranger to notice. Nobody did. People walked past carrying coffee. Parents were talking to their children. Teenagers were looking at their phones. A cleaner smiled politely as we passed each other. Life continued exactly as it always had. For the first time, I understood something experienced crossdressers often say: people are far too busy living their own lives to analyze yours. That realization removed half of my anxiety. I wandered into a clothing shop and began browsing quietly. At first, I pretended I was shopping for someone else. Then I caught myself. Why was I pretending? I picked up a soft cardigan and looked at the size label without rushing. A sales assistant approached with a friendly smile. "Would you like another size?" For a split second, I froze. Then I answered honestly, "Yes, if you have the next size up." She nodded, disappeared into the stockroom, and returned 2 minutes later. No strange expression. No awkward questions. No judgment. Just normal customer service. As I thanked her, something inside me shifted again. Acceptance doesn't always arrive through dramatic speeches. Sometimes it arrives through ordinary moments that quietly tell you you're allowed to exist. Over the next few months, I became much more selective about what I bought. Instead of filling my wardrobe with impulse purchases, I built outfits that actually worked together. Neutral colors, comfortable shoes, versatile tops, simple accessories. I discovered that a smaller wardrobe filled with pieces I genuinely loved brought me far more happiness than shelves overflowing with clothes I never wore. My makeup collection shrank too. I stopped buying every trendy product I saw online. Instead, I learned which shades suited my skin tone and which products gave a natural finish. Blending became more important than covering. Good skincare became more valuable than heavy foundation. Ironically, the less makeup I wore, the more confident I felt. One evening I looked through photographs from my earliest days. I almost didn't recognize myself. Not because I looked masculine, because I looked frightened. Every smile seemed forced. Every pose looked uncertain. Every photograph was asking the same silent question. Do I look convincing? The newer photos asked a completely different question. Where should I go next? That difference had nothing to do with appearance. It was confidence. The biggest lesson I learned wasn't about passing. It was about peace. There came a day when I realized I hadn't thought about whether I was pretending for weeks. I had simply enjoyed getting dressed, meeting a friend for coffee, walking through town, returning home, and ending another completely ordinary day. Ordinary. That word meant everything. Because what once felt like an impossible fantasy had quietly become normal life. And that's when I finally understood the truth I wish someone had told me years earlier. Crossdressing stopped feeling like pretending, not because my makeup became perfect, not because my wardrobe became expensive, and not because strangers accepted me. It stopped feeling like pretending because I stopped asking permission to enjoy being myself. The mirror hadn't changed. The clothes hadn't changed. I had. Months passed, and something unexpected happened. The excitement I used to feel every time I opened my wardrobe slowly transformed into something quieter, something steadier. The butterflies never completely disappeared, but they were no longer fueled by fear of being caught or the thrill of doing something secret. They were replaced by anticipation. The same feeling someone might have before meeting close friends, visiting a favorite cafe, or taking a peaceful walk on a sunny afternoon. That change was difficult to explain to anyone who hadn't experienced it. People often imagine crossdressing as one dramatic moment. A person opens a wardrobe, puts on a dress, and suddenly everything changes. My experience was nothing like that. It changed through hundreds of tiny moments. Learning which fabrics felt comfortable after wearing them for hours. Discovering that the right hairstyle could completely change the balance of my face. Realizing that a genuine smile was more convincing than any amount of contouring. Understanding that confidence could never be bought in a cosmetics aisle. One evening, while organizing my wardrobe, I noticed something that made me laugh. At the very back of the shelf sat my very first outfit. The inexpensive skirt. The oversized blouse. The worn-out tights I had once considered my greatest treasure. I picked them up carefully and smiled. Not because they still looked good. They didn't. They reminded me of someone who had been desperately searching for permission to be happy. That person deserved kindness. Instead of throwing them away, I folded them neatly and placed them into a keepsake box. Not because I planned to wear them again, because they reminded me how far I'd come. A few weeks later, I accepted an invitation to meet several other crossdressers for coffee. For nearly an hour, I sat in my car wondering whether to leave. My imagination invented every possible disaster. What if they didn't like me? What if I wasn't feminine enough? What if everyone else looked perfect? Eventually, I took a deep breath and walked inside. Within seconds, I realized how wrong my assumptions had been. Nobody was competing. Nobody was judging. Everyone had a different story. One person had been dressing privately for over 20 years. Another had only started 6 months earlier. Someone else preferred elegant dresses. Another loved casual jeans and trainers. One enjoyed glamorous makeup. Another hardly wore any at all. Yet despite all those differences, everyone shared the same feeling. Relief. Relief that, for a few hours, nobody had to explain themselves. Listening to their stories taught me something important. Every journey looked different. Some people wanted cross-dressing to remain an occasional hobby. Others saw it as part of exploring their gender. Some simply loved fashion. Others found confidence they never experienced before. There wasn't one correct destination. There were only honest journeys. That realization removed another invisible weight from my shoulders. I stopped comparing my path with everyone else's. Comparison had stolen enough joy already. Instead, I focused on becoming a better version of myself each week. Sometimes that meant improving my makeup. Sometimes it meant buying nothing at all. Sometimes it simply meant treating myself with more patience. One rainy afternoon, I found myself helping a newcomer in an online community. They posted a nervous message asking whether they looked real enough. I recognized the fear immediately. Years earlier, I had asked the exact same question. I typed a reply, then deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that too. Finally, I wrote something much simpler. You don't need to look like someone else. You only need to feel comfortable being yourself. Skills improve with practice. Confidence grows with experience. After sending it, I realized those words weren't only for them. They were for me too. As the seasons changed, my wardrobe evolved naturally. Bright colors found their place beside neutral ones. Comfort became just as important as appearance. Instead of buying clothes because they looked fashionable online, I bought pieces that made me smile the moment I put them on. My morning routine became surprisingly ordinary. Coffee. Music playing quietly in the background. Choosing an outfit. Applying light makeup if I felt like it. Checking the weather before deciding which shoes to wear. It no longer felt like preparing for a transformation. It felt like getting ready for another day. One afternoon, I walked past the same shop window where, months earlier, I had studied my reflection with nervous curiosity. I stopped again. This time, I wasn't checking my makeup. I wasn't wondering whether strangers could tell. I wasn't adjusting my posture. I simply caught my reflection for a second before continuing to walk. Only after several steps did I realize something remarkable. I had forgotten to analyze myself. That habit, the one that had consumed so much of my energy, had quietly disappeared. For years, every reflection had been an inspection. Now it was just a reflection. That tiny moment felt bigger than any makeover, any compliment, or any successful shopping trip, because it meant I had finally stopped treating myself like a problem that needed solving. I had become someone simply living life. Looking back, I sometimes wonder what would happen if I could meet the nervous version of myself who had clothes under the bed and panicked whenever the doorbell rang. I don't think I'd give advice about makeup. I wouldn't talk about wigs or fashion. I'd probably just smile and say, be patient. You're not racing towards perfection. You're slowly learning to feel at home in your own skin. One day you'll stop asking whether you're pretending because you'll be too busy enjoying your life. And that, more than anything else, was the greatest transformation of all. It wasn't about changing into someone new. It was about discovering that the confidence I'd been searching for had been growing quietly with every step, every lesson, every mistake, and every ordinary day I allowed myself to live authentically. The day cross-dressing stopped feeling like pretending wasn't the end of my journey. It was the day my real journey finally began. The funny thing about confidence is that you rarely notice the exact day it arrives. Fear announces itself loudly. Confidence usually walks in quietly. I realized that months later, when I opened my wardrobe one Saturday morning and spent more time deciding between two cardigans than wondering whether I should dress at all. That simple choice made me smile. There had been a time when every outfit felt like a life-changing decision. Now it felt as ordinary as deciding what to have for breakfast. I started creating little traditions that had nothing to do with proving anything. Sunday mornings became my favorite. I'd make coffee, open the windows, let fresh air fill the room, and spend an hour organizing outfits for the week. Instead of buying clothes because they looked dramatic online, I focused on combinations that felt natural. A soft jumper with straight-leg jeans. A simple blouse under a lightweight jacket. Comfortable ankle boots for cooler evenings. I discovered that the outfits I reached for most often weren't the ones that attracted attention. They were the ones that allowed me to forget I was even thinking about clothes. That lesson spilled into every part of my life. I stopped measuring success by how perfectly I could imitate someone else. Instead, I asked myself a different question every evening. Did I enjoy today? If the answer was yes, then I considered it a successful day regardless of whether my eyeliner was perfectly even or my hair behaved exactly the way I wanted. One afternoon, while browsing a small boutique, I overheard two women discussing colors that suited their skin tone. They weren't talking about fashion trends or expensive brands. They were simply sharing ideas with each other. I quietly listened while pretending to browse nearby. Their conversation reminded me that style isn't about following rules. It's about discovering what makes you feel comfortable and expressing that naturally. When I got home, I emptied my wardrobe onto the bed. Instead of keeping clothes because I hoped I'd wear them someday, I asked myself a simple question for every item. Does this make me feel like myself? If the answer was no, it went into a donation pile. By the end of the afternoon, my wardrobe looked half empty. Oddly enough, it felt twice as useful. Everything hanging there had earned its place. Every outfit represented confidence instead of uncertainty. As the months rolled on, people around me began noticing subtle changes that had nothing to do with appearance. Friends commented that I seemed calmer. My colleagues mentioned I smiled more often. One family member even asked if I'd started exercising because I looked healthier. I hadn't changed my fitness routine. I hadn't won the lottery. I hadn't discovered some magical secret. I had simply stopped carrying the constant weight of pretending to be someone I wasn't comfortable being. Stress leaves marks that even the best makeup can't hide. Peace leaves marks too. One evening I found myself helping another newcomer online who had written a long message about feeling discouraged after seeing perfectly edited photos on social media. They believed they would never measure up. I understood that feeling completely. I replied with complete honesty. The internet usually shows someone's best 5 minutes, not their ordinary Tuesday evening. Don't compare your first chapter to someone else's 10th year. Focus on learning one new skill at a time. A week later, they thanked me and shared new photos. The improvement wasn't dramatic, but their smile was. That reminded me of my own early photographs. The technical improvements over the years were obvious, but the biggest difference was impossible to measure. The fear had disappeared from my eyes. Eventually, I challenged myself to travel to a neighboring town for the day. I wanted a fresh experience somewhere nobody knew me. The train journey felt strangely peaceful. I looked around the carriage and realized everyone else was busy reading, listening to music, or staring out of the window. Nobody was analyzing me. Nobody was keeping score. By lunchtime, I was sitting outside a small cafe enjoying a sandwich and watching people walk past. Children laughed as they chased pigeons across the square. An elderly couple shared a slice of cake. Cyclists rang their bells while weaving through the streets. Life was happening all around me. For years, I had imagined that stepping outside dressed the way I wanted would make me the center of attention. Instead, I became part of the background like everyone else. That ordinary feeling turned out to be extraordinary. As the sun began to set, I caught my reflection in another shop window. Months earlier, I would have stopped to inspect every detail. This time I smiled without slowing down. Not because everything looked perfect, because perfection no longer mattered. I finally understood something that had taken years to learn. Crossdressing had never really been about clothes. The clothes were simply the doorway. Beyond that doorway, I discovered patience, creativity, confidence, resilience, and the courage to accept myself a little more each day. The dresses didn't create happiness. The makeup didn't create confidence. The wigs didn't create peace. They simply gave me the opportunity to explore parts of myself that I had ignored for far too long. Looking back now, I don't think the title of my journey would be about transformation at all. It would be about permission. Permission to learn slowly. Permission to make mistakes. Permission to improve. Permission to enjoy fashion without guilt. Permission to stop comparing myself with everyone else. And most importantly, Permission to recognize that authenticity doesn't always arrive with a dramatic announcement. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as an ordinary morning when you get dressed, glance in the mirror, smile without overthinking, pick up your keys and walk out the door ready to enjoy the day. That was the moment I finally understood why crossdressing had stopped feeling like pretending. It wasn't because I had become someone different. It was because I had finally stopped pretending to myself. The first time someone complimented my outfit without hesitation, I almost looked over my shoulder to see who they were talking to. It happened in the most ordinary place imaginable. A small bookshop tucked between a bakery and a florist. I had wandered inside to escape a sudden rain shower, shaking tiny drops of water from my umbrella before folding it closed. The shop smelled of old paper and fresh coffee, the kind of place where people whispered without anyone asking them to. I was browsing a shelf of travel books when an older woman stepped beside me. She glanced at the cardigan I was wearing, smiled warmly, and said, "That color suits you beautifully." For a second, my mind froze. Years earlier, I had imagined every conversation with a stranger would involve awkward questions or suspicious looks. Instead, I received a compliment about a cardigan. I thanked her with a smile. She nodded politely and continued searching for a book. The conversation lasted less than 10 seconds. Yet I thought about it for the rest of the week. Not because someone had praised my clothes, because nothing else happened. There was no dramatic reveal. No uncomfortable silence. No interrogation. Just two strangers sharing an ordinary moment. Walking back to my car later that afternoon, I realized how many imaginary disasters I had invented over the years. Most of them had never happened. That didn't mean difficult moments couldn't happen. Of course they could. But fear had convinced me they would happen every single time. Reality turned out to be much quieter. As my confidence grew, I became interested in understanding style instead of simply collecting clothes. I learned that building a wardrobe wasn't about owning hundreds of outfits. It was about owning pieces that worked together. Soft neutral tops. Comfortable jeans. A few skirts that actually suited my proportions. Simple jackets. Scarves that added color without overwhelming everything else. Instead of buying whatever looked exciting online, I started asking practical questions. Can I wear this in 3 different ways? Will it still feel comfortable after several hours? Does it fit my personal style instead of someone else's? Those questions saved me money and filled my wardrobe with clothes I genuinely enjoyed wearing. The same happened with shoes. When I first started, I believed heels were essential. Eventually, I discovered something surprising. Confidence comes from comfort. If I spent the entire day worrying about sore feet, I wasn't enjoying myself. There was absolutely nothing wrong with wearing comfortable flats or trainers. They allowed me to focus on conversations instead of every step I took. That lesson extended far beyond comfort creates confidence. Confidence creates natural behavior. Natural behavior is what people notice most. One evening, I attended a small social gathering organized by a local community group. Everyone came from different backgrounds. Some had years of experience expressing themselves through fashion. Others, like me once upon a time, were still learning. Near the end of the evening, a newcomer quietly admitted they almost hadn't come. "I changed outfits 6 times," they said with an embarrassed laugh. The room immediately filled with knowing smiles. Nearly everyone had done exactly the same thing. Someone admitted they once spent 4 hours getting ready before canceling at the last minute. Another confessed they had bought expensive makeup before learning basic skincare. We laughed together, not because those experiences were silly, but because they were familiar. Perfection had delayed so many of us. Action was what finally moved us forward. Driving home that night, I realized how powerful shared experiences could be. For years, I believed I was the only person worrying about tiny details. The only person changing outfits repeatedly. The only person questioning every decision. I wasn't. Many people had walked that same path before me. That thought removed another layer of loneliness. Weeks later, I decided to challenge myself in a completely different way. Instead of focusing on appearance, I focused on conversation. I visited a quiet cafe carrying a novel I had been meaning to finish. Normally, I would have spent the entire visit wondering whether people were looking at me. This time I gave myself a simple rule. Pay more attention to the story than to yourself. Whenever anxious thoughts appeared, I gently returned my attention to the pages. Half an hour passed, then an hour. When I finally looked up, I realized something incredible. I had completely forgotten to worry. The background noise of cups clinking together, quiet conversations, and soft music had become more interesting than my own anxious thoughts. That ordinary afternoon taught me one of the biggest lessons of my entire journey. People experience life most fully when they stop making themselves the center of every imagined observation. Everyone around me was living their own stories. The barista was learning new coffee recipes. A university student was studying for exams. Two friends were planning a holiday. An elderly man was reading the morning newspaper from beginning to end. Nobody had paused their life to analyze mine. Once I accepted that truth, the world felt much bigger. I became more curious. I explored museums, markets, and parks. I started noticing flowers in public gardens, street musicians, interesting architecture, fresh bread cooling behind bakery windows. For so long, anxiety had narrowed my focus until I could only think about myself. Confidence widened it again. One rainy evening, while sorting through old boxes in the wardrobe, I found the notebook where I had written my earliest goals. Some made me smile. Learn eyeliner. Walk outside for 5 minutes. Buy clothes in person. Take one photo without deleting it. Every single goal had once felt impossible. Now they were simply memories. I turned to the final page. It was blank. Without thinking too much, I picked up a pen and wrote a new sentence. Keep living honestly, one ordinary day at a time. The words weren't dramatic. They didn't need to be. The biggest victories rarely announce themselves with fireworks. Sometimes they arrive quietly, disguised as peaceful mornings, genuine smiles, and the comforting feeling that you're no longer hiding from your own reflection. As I closed the notebook, I realized it had documented far more than a change in style. It had documented the slow disappearance of fear. And somewhere between those first uncertain entries and the words I had just written, I found the answer I had been searching for from the very beginning. Crossdressing hadn't changed who I was. It had given me the courage to stop running from the person I had always been becoming. One evening, long after I had stopped counting how many times I had gone out dressed the way I wanted, I noticed something that caught me completely off guard. I was getting ready for dinner with a few friends when my phone buzzed with a reminder. Months earlier, that reminder would have said, "Leave extra time for makeup." Now it simply read, "Don't forget the reservation." I laughed. There was a time when every outing revolved around whether I looked convincing enough. Every mirror became a checkpoint. Every reflection invited another adjustment. Every tiny imperfection felt enormous. Now I was more worried about arriving on time than whether my eyeliner was perfectly symmetrical. That simple change said everything. As I locked the front door behind me, I realized my confidence no longer depended on flawless presentation. It came from familiarity. Dressing had become part of my routine rather than an event I spent days preparing for. The evening itself was wonderfully ordinary. We talked about films, favorite restaurants, travel plans, and work. Nobody discussed appearance for more than a passing compliment about someone's jacket. We laughed over terrible jokes, shared desserts, and argued playfully about which holiday destination had the best beaches. Driving home afterwards, I realized something important. The happiest moments weren't the ones where I felt noticed. They were the ones where I forgot to think about myself at all. That became my biggest goal. Not to become invisible, but to become present. To actually experience life instead of constantly analyzing how I appeared while living it. A few weeks later, I decided to revisit the very first shopping center where I had once walked with trembling hands and a racing heart. Everything looked the same. The same entrance. The same cafes. The same music drifting through the corridors. Yet everything felt different because I was different. I stopped outside the clothing store where I had once stood frozen, afraid to ask for another size. Walking inside now felt almost effortless. A sales assistant greeted me with a smile. "Good afternoon. Let me know if you'd like any help." "I will. Thank you," I replied naturally. There was no rehearsing my voice beforehand. No second-guessing every word. Just a normal conversation between two people. While browsing, I noticed another customer studying a rack of jumpers. They looked uncertain, holding two colors up against themselves before putting both back. For a moment, I recognized the same hesitation I used to carry everywhere. Without overthinking it, I smiled and said, "The blue one really brings out the color of the scarf you're wearing."
They looked surprised.
Really? I think so. They picked it up again, smiled, and headed towards the changing rooms. It was such a tiny interaction, but it reminded me how encouraging a few kind words could be. Years earlier, now I was able to offer it to someone else. That felt like real progress. Over time, I also became less interested in chasing trends. Fashion changes constantly.
Confidence doesn't.
Instead of asking, "Is this popular?" I started asking, "Will I still enjoy wearing this next year?" That question completely transformed my wardrobe. Classic pieces stayed. Impulse purchases disappeared. Comfort always won. I discovered that building personal style wasn't about copying magazines or social media. It was about recognizing patterns in what genuinely made me feel happy. Soft fabrics, simple colors, clean lines, clothes that allowed me to move comfortably instead of constantly adjusting them. Those choices reflected my personality far better than anything flashy ever had. One quiet Sunday afternoon, I opened an old folder on my computer containing hundreds of photographs from the beginning of my journey. For nearly an hour, I clicked through them one by one. Some made me cringe. Some made me laugh. Some brought back memories I hadn't thought about in years. But instead of judging those early versions of myself, I felt grateful. Every awkward photograph represented someone who refused to give up. Someone willing to practice. Someone determined to improve. Growth isn't always attractive while it's happening. Sometimes it looks messy. Sometimes it feels painfully slow. But looking backwards reveals progress that day-to-day life often hides. That evening I created a new folder called Milestones. Not because the photographs were perfect, because they reminded me that every confident person was once a beginner. Before going to bed, I stood in front of the mirror one last time. Not to inspect myself, just to smile. The reflection smiling back wasn't perfect. Never had been. Probably never would be. But perfection had quietly stopped being the destination. Peace had taken its place. And peace turned out to be far more beautiful than perfection ever could have been. If someone had asked me years ago what I hoped to gain from cross-dressing, I probably would have answered with something about appearance. Looking back now, that answer would have been completely wrong. I didn't gain a different face. I gained patience. I didn't gain a perfect wardrobe. I gained confidence. I didn't become someone else. I finally stopped hiding from the person I had been all along. Cross-dressing stopped feeling like pretending because I no longer measured it against anyone else's expectations. It became a quiet expression of comfort, creativity, and honesty. Every lesson, every mistake, every nervous step outside the front door had slowly built something much more valuable than a convincing appearance. They built a life where I no longer woke up wondering who I was supposed to be. I simply woke up, chose an outfit that made me smile, and got on with my day. For the first time in my life, that felt completely natural. And if there's one lesson my journey taught me above everything else, it's this. Confidence doesn't arrive all at once. It grows through ordinary moments, small acts of courage, and the willingness to keep moving forward even when progress feels invisible. One day you realize you aren't trying to become someone new anymore. You're simply allowing the truest version of yourself to be seen. That's the moment everything changes, not because the world suddenly looks at you differently, but because you finally look at yourself with kindness. That's when cross-dressing truly stops feeling like pretending and simply starts feeling like home. By the time I reached that point, people often assumed my journey had become effortless. They imagined that once confidence arrived, every doubt disappeared forever. I used to believe that too. The truth was much more human. Confidence doesn't erase uncertainty. It simply teaches you that uncertainty doesn't have to control your decisions. There were still mornings when an outfit didn't feel quite right. There were evenings when I removed my makeup and wondered whether I had improved as much as I thought. There were moments when old fears quietly knocked on the door again. The difference was simple. I no longer invited those fears inside. Instead of listening to the voice that whispered, "You're not good enough," I answered it with experience. "I've felt this before. I'll be fine. And tomorrow will be easier." That conversation with myself became one of the healthiest habits I ever developed. Not because it made every day perfect, because it stopped one difficult moment from ruining an entire week. One Saturday morning, I visited a weekend market filled with handmade jewelry, flowers, local artists, and tiny food stalls. The atmosphere felt relaxed, with people wandering slowly between colorful displays while musicians played acoustic songs nearby. I bought a cup of coffee and simply walked. No destination, no schedule, just enjoying the day. At one stall, an elderly artist was selling hand-painted bookmarks. Every design had delicate flowers painted in soft watercolors. "They're beautiful," I said. She smiled. "Thank you. I paint everyone by hand." I spent several minutes looking through them before choosing one with lavender flowers. As she wrapped it carefully in tissue paper, she said something I'll never forget. "You have a very calm energy." I smiled politely and thanked her, but those words stayed with me all day. Years earlier, nobody would have described me as calm, anxious, quiet, nervous. Those words would have fit perfectly. Calm? Never. That comment made me realize how much had changed beneath the surface. The confidence people noticed wasn't coming from clothes or makeup. It came from finally feeling comfortable in my own company. That evening, I slipped the bookmark into my favorite novel. Every time I opened that book afterwards, I remembered her words. Not because they were extraordinary, because they reflected a version of myself I had worked incredibly hard to become. As time passed, I found myself spending less time shopping and more time creating experiences. Weekend walks, photography, reading in parks, trying new cafes, visiting museums. Life gradually became richer because I stopped waiting for confidence before enjoying it. I started enjoying life first. Confidence quietly followed. One afternoon, I met someone who had only recently begun exploring crossdressing. They recognized me from a local community event and nervously asked whether we could talk over coffee. For nearly 2 hours, they asked question after question. What if people stare? What if I make mistakes? What if I never look feminine enough? What if I lose confidence halfway through? I smiled because every single question sounded familiar. Instead of giving complicated answers, I shared stories. The time I accidentally wore mismatched earrings. The day I walked confidently through town with lipstick on my teeth without realizing until lunchtime. The afternoon I bought shoes that looked wonderful but became painfully uncomfortable after 10 minutes. We laughed together. Then I said something I genuinely believed. Nobody becomes comfortable by waiting until they're perfect. They become comfortable by collecting ordinary experiences. That sentence seemed to lift a weight from their shoulders. Before we left, they thanked me for being honest instead of pretending everything had always been easy. As I walked home afterwards, I realized that perhaps my journey had become valuable not because I had reached some imaginary finish line, but because I remembered what the beginning felt like. Empathy grows from memory. The struggles that once embarrassed me had become the very experiences allowing me to encourage someone else. Months later, I received a message from that same person. They had gone shopping confidently for the first time. They weren't celebrating because everything had gone perfectly. They were celebrating because they had finally stopped waiting for perfection. Reading those words made me smile. The cycle continued. Someone had unknowingly encouraged me years earlier. Now I had encouraged someone else. Perhaps one day they would do exactly the same for another nervous beginner. That thought filled me with hope. One quiet evening, I sat on my balcony watching the sunset paint the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. A gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass from a nearby garden. Children laughed somewhere in the distance while birds settled into the trees for the night. Moments like that used to pass unnoticed because my mind was always occupied with worry. Now I noticed everything. The changing colors, the peaceful silence between sounds, The comfort of simply existing without feeling the need to prove anything. I realized that this was the greatest gift my journey had given me. Presence. Not perfection. Presence. Being fully aware of the life unfolding around me instead of constantly wondering how I appeared within it. Looking back, I could divide my journey into 2 chapters. The first was about becoming someone I hoped the world would accept. The second was about accepting myself regardless of what the world expected. Only the second chapter brought real peace. If I could leave one final message for anyone standing where I once stood, frightened, uncertain, and convinced they would never feel comfortable, it would be this. Be patient with yourself. Celebrate small victories. Allow yourself to learn. Don't compare your beginning with someone else's middle. Every confident step you admire was built upon hundreds of uncertain ones that nobody ever saw. One day you'll catch your reflection unexpectedly, not to judge it, not to criticize it, simply to smile. And in that quiet, ordinary moment, you'll realize something beautiful. The pretending ended long ago. You just didn't notice because you were too busy living your life. And perhaps that's the truest ending any journey could ever have.